So what are we going to talk about today? I already gave you a basic rundown, but to be more specific, we are going to be talking about apples and pears, because you can generally treat them the same way. Peaches, figs, and blackberries. Blackberry is the representative for caneberry because blackberry can actually grow here. We're going to talk about site selection. Of course, with my thesis, we're talking about chill hours and dormancy. I didn't spend 2.5 years to never talk about it again. So we're going to talk about our trees and our cultivar selections, and Karen has provided some cultivar selections, so she will jump in at that point. We're going to talk about planting. Well, I think we have a video on planting, and we're going to talk about common pests and diseases. Now, there's so many, we couldn't really go in depth, so I'm just going to give you lists of what they are. So site selection is very simple and straightforward. You need full sun. Full sun is that not 6+ hours, it can be more depending. I think Karen, you were telling me 8 to 10 for fig. So you just need full sun, period. Now, most of you are not gonna have an orchard, but spacing and pruning is important for light penetration for 2 different reasons: for your disease prevalence. If you have it dark and humid under this very thick canopy, is a perfect place for fungus to come out and have fun. So that's your disease side of it. And flower formation, if you don't have your light hitting all your little buds, because everything's so thick, it can interrupt, or it can make your flowering uneven. Temperature can also do that, and I'll talk about why in a second. But that's really straightforward. Now, the thing that people tend to forget, doesn't matter if it's a fruit tree or not, is read the tag and find out how big it gets. Because I worked on a peach orchard. We worked with different cultivars, but on average, they were like this big. So if you buy one for your house, you do not want to shove it in a corner. You do not want to put it in a tight space, especially if you want like commercial amounts of fruit. So that varies by cultivar, but we will talk about that too. So that's very straightforward. Soil and pH and drainage. So we could spend probably 30 minutes talking about this, so we're just gonna dilute that. The pH of 6 to 6.5 for your apples, peaches, and pears, and you want a pH of 5.8 and 6.8 in sandy loam soil for blackberries. For your peaches, apples, and pears, you do not want poorly draining soil. They cannot handle it. This can also lead to root rot and other diseases. Apples tend to prefer sandy loam and clay loam, and I know this is like, it's like sand but not sand, and clay but not clay, is how I would describe it. Peaches prefer sandy loam, which is funny considering that we have them in Georgia with our Georgia clay, which about 6 inches down, we get our real red clay. Pears like sandy soils, but unlike apples and peaches, they are more tolerant of your poor draining soil. And figs, just don't put them in sand. They're a super plant, but they don't like sandy soil, generally speaking. And of course, regardless of whether you're doing fruit or not, always make sure you get your soil tested beforehand, because of course we have our pH ranges. And if you want to do blueberry, that pH range is actually closer to 4 to 5. Blueberries are the outlier. But get your soil tested, figure out what your pH is, and check everything else and make your amendments. So for air temperature and air drainage is kind of the same as how I was talking about light. You need airflow, not just within your tree, but between your plants, for disease reasons, but also for temperature reasons. So high humidity, we need that airflow to mitigate that humidity. Very straightforward. High temperature, you need a breeze to go through. Very simple, right? So that's a very easy principle to pick up, and that's a picture my friend took at our research orchard in Georgia. It's one of my favorites. So that's very straightforward, but the fun part, the little bit more complicated part, chill hours and freezes. So a lot of these are actually, this is from my own research. I was dissecting, we have fruiting wood up here. On the right, we have a floral peach bud, and right here we have a vegetative peach bud. So that's where your leaves come out. And you can see the brown in the middle, they're dead. My experiment consisted of putting them in a freezer that increasingly got colder over an 8-hour period, and then we would check afterwards to see if they survived or not, depending on your treatment groups. So that's what that's from. Chill hours are the number of cold hours needed for plants to develop, because they have, when they go to dormancy, they have their own little cycle. Plants shut down, they just, like a bear, right, within each of your buds. Here in North Carolina, we get 750 to 1,000 chill hours. That matters when you are picking out your cultivar. For example, in New Jersey, where I'm from, northern high bush blueberries are what they grow up there because they can handle it. But you come down to the south, you're going to be growing southern high bush, or in Georgia, more in Georgia, rabbit eye. So you have to pay attention for your cultivars for that is one of your reasons. Now, that uneven blooming outside of light, weird temperature fluctuations. As we all know, sometimes when we get unusually warm weather, you see your daffodils come up out of nowhere. Same thing happens with your floral buds in your fruits. Your blooms can come up early. I remember, when was it? It was last year. We had an unusually warm pocket, and I was going into the orchard and doing my bloom counts, and I had some full blooms in February because of the unusual warm air we had. And guess what happened when we had freeze? And we'll go a little bit more detail about that. But of course, you can't control the weather. There are certain things you can do, but once your tree gets big enough, pray. And there are two different types of frost and freeze events, and that actually does matter when we talk about freeze protection. So this is a picture from, I think, Iowa State. This is an effective freeze. So an effective freeze, you can think of like a cold weather front, okay? This is accompanied by wind or typically precipitation. Cold air just comes and sucks all the warm air out, as it's showing in this picture. Because as we learned from chemistry way back in the day, temperature, warm air rises. So all that warm air from the ground is just getting sucked out by that wind. These are the more tricky guys to deal with. And then these are our radiative freezes, which is again, that simple gas chemistry. Our warm air rises, our cold air sinks. And at some point you have that inversion layer, which is that mixing of those two airs. But as you can see from this picture, our cold air is down where our plants are. And if you unfortunately decide to put a fruit tree or plant in general at the lowest point on your property, cold air is going to sink there and cool there. So another side tip from site selection. If you have a pancake yard, you're fine. But if you have uneven topography, you're going to want to put your fruit at your higher elevation. And that's the reason why. Now, radiative freezes is just when it's cold outside. If there's wind or rain, it's not because of this. It's just cold out, right? And because of this, because there's no wind or rain, this is a lot easier to deal with when you're looking at your freeze protection than your effective freeze, because wind and rain is a pain. So again, this is the topography like I was showing you. If you don't prune and you have bad drainage, you create those little pockets. And that's in the cold. When it's hot out, then you create heat pockets and it's just, you're frying your plants and you're letting fungus go crazy. So pruning and choosing higher elevations in your yard or your property help kind of mitigate this. And if you have a deck or something, especially on the second floor, and you have potted plants, put them out there, especially if they're getting good sun, because you're not getting that like cold air sink. So I talked about that uneven blooming and why a freeze can kill it. Now I'm actually going to tell you the numbers behind that. So these are all my pictures that I took from school. These are the floral development stages for peach floral blooms. Now, the reason I'm going stage by stage with you is because right here on the bottom, we have an LT90. Now that stands for the lethal temperature at which 90% of your floral buds die. Now, as we go through our developmental stages, we'll see that temperature increases. So dormant, totally fine. Buds swell, your buds get a little bit rounder. The lethal temperature for that is 1 degree Fahrenheit. They develop a little more. We got bud bursts. That goes up to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Our 1/4 inch green, this is usually, the sunlight kind of blocks it, but this is when you start to see your leaves poking out, your vegetative buds, goes up to 9 degrees. First pink, because you can literally see the tips of the flower petals, 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a huge jump. And when you get to your first bloom, that is 21 degrees Fahrenheit. And of course, it's different across different cultivars and different fruits. One of the resources I gave you is a publication from Washington State that actually has this data for multiple fruit along with their own pictures. Mine are better, but you know. So as you can see, the more it develops, the less it can handle it. And with petal fall, it's even higher than 21 degrees, which that starts to become a problem here, right? If you're up somewhere in like Michigan, well, then all these other temperatures will matter. Here, we really have to worry about when we get to our first bloom and our petal fall. And our fruit set, I don't know if I've read anywhere what the lethal temperature is, but it's obviously way higher than like 30 degrees. So this is why freeze protection and things matter. Now, of course, when your tree gets big enough, there's not much you can do, but these pictures here are what you would do from an orchard perspective, or what you can do, because these have their pros and cons. But as a homeowner, the things you can do is location, location, location. High elevation, whether it is a porch or it is a higher elevation on your yard, putting it, if you have a southern facing side of your property, that gets the most light, including in the winter. So that is considered generally the warmest side of your house, with the north side of your house being the coldest. So if you have anything, especially if you have it in a container, put it on that southern facing side for your most light. Now covering them, you can do that when they're young and when they're small enough, unless you somehow have enough money to get giant blankets for trees. You can cover, it doesn't have to be any type of fancy material, it can be a blanket or an insulating material. So you can do that in the case of a freeze if you can't bring them inside, or if you don't have a southern facing porch. Of course, this depends on the size of whatever you have. Now, water. I would not recommend this on a homeowner level. I'm just explaining to you how it is viable on a commercial level. This picture is actually where it's typically used. It's typically used for smaller plants, or like, you know, when you have younger plants. Constantly spraying water over your plants during a freeze actually helps, because water freezing is an exothermic reaction. It releases heat, and that heat can actually provide about 2 degrees Celsius of freeze protection, which, when it comes down to it, that could be a huge difference when it comes to like 90% of your crop dying, 50% of your crop dying. Of course, running your irrigation for 24 hours is very expensive, so leave that to the farmers. And that over there on the right is a windmill or a fan. This is typically used more commonly in Georgia with peach trees. And if we go back, it is the reason you have that fan is because you are mixing that warm air and cold air from irradiated trees. But as such, that obviously doesn't work in an effective freeze when the wind took out everything. So a lot of our freeze protection strategies are limited based on the freeze that you have. And then of course you just use fire, which is used in Europe in orchards. I don't know if you guys remember in 2020, there was a very bad late spring freeze, and a bunch of orchards in Europe literally just had like barrels with fire, like every X amount of feet through their orchard. Of course, pollution, even though soot does provide freeze protection, which is kind of crazy. Pollution, manpower, money, a lot of these things have their drawbacks, which is why I was doing my research and it didn't work. So, no, that's fine. So that is our freezes. Again, they're more tricky to handle. All right, so now that we're done with our site selection, we're going to move on to our cultivars. So we have different tree sizes. Dwarfing, zoom in 5, tiny. There's our human at 6 feet. Semi-dwarfing, which is 12 to 15 feet high, and our vigorous, which is 20 to 35 feet high, and this is high and wide. You know, this depends on your pruning. So looking at your tags and paying attention to whether you have dwarfing, semi-dwarfing, or vigorous is very important. And another thing is, this is the most common question if people find out, you know, about fruit. Why doesn't my tree have fruit? Why does it only have one? Now, while there's a million different reasons as to why that could be, I always ask, how old is it? Because people are like, oh, my peach tree doesn't have fruit. I'm like, how old is it? 2. Peach trees take about 2 to 4 years, but more commonly 4 to 5 years to bear an actual commercial amount of fruit. So if your tree is 2, I would be amazed if you had more than 2 fruit on it. For apples, it's 2 to 3 years old for your dwarfing varieties, but it can take up to 8 years depending on what you have. And these are just overall generalizations. This isn't point by point. Pears take 3 to 10 years. Figs, our super tree, can take 6 months. And blackberries can take 1 year to just have a crop, but by that second year, they're having that full crop that you would expect. Or as Bryce Lane like to say, what's on the tag? So if anyone asks, just ask them how old it is, and that is usually the answer to the question. So our grafts and our rootstocks and our scions, those terms I was using earlier refer to the different parts of a grafted plant. So our rootstock, as the name implies, is what goes into the ground. That is selected for disease prevalence. For example, my graduate advisor and some other professors from the University of Florida just patented a rootstock MP29 for peaches because it has nematode resistance. Just as an example. So whatever you're putting in the ground, it's usually because it's good at fighting something. Now the scion, that's the part that you want. Like if we're talking tomato, like you want, I love Roma. So like the scion for me would be aroma regardless of what's going below the ground. So those are our two sections. So, but that actual specific part where you graft it is called the graft union. Now, regardless of anything we talk about today in regards to that, the one thing you need to know is that your graft union needs to be 6 inches above your soil. If your graft union is under the soil, it can actually, the scion, the top part, could actually be forced out and the rootstock can still grow out. And there's a bunch of other things you can have, but that graft union, 6 inches above the ground, always. Avoid, I know that shows a little bit of a mound, but I remember when Bryce Lamb was here, he was talking about those mulch volcanoes. We need to keep that graft union above the ground. Because really what you need to do when you graft is that the rootstock and your fruiting would need to be the same size. They have to have the same diameter. You can't have a giant rootstock and a tiny little shoot on top. It's not going to work, and vice versa, because the graft won't hold. And there's different types of cuts you can make. You can do like a diagonal cut. You can do a little slat cut where you like slide it in. That's what we did when I was in school. We made, it's like a little T cut you make, and then you make a similar cut on your scion and you slide it in together. Now, regardless, you're always going to tie it with rubber band or something to hold it. And usually depending on where you graft, that material that you use to bind it can come off. But at some point, you're still going to want to go and check and make sure it comes off so it's not girdling the connection, which is why we also don't like bagworms, if you remember, because they girdle your wood. So yeah, don't buy non-grafted trees, or if you do, maybe know what technique or two. So cultivar selection, and Karen, feel free to jump in at any time because I'm just going to be reading these off. I still am in my Georgia cultivar range because contender does terrible in Georgia. I think we had like 500 of those baby trees and like 400 of them died. So it's amazing to me that contender.
That's amazing here.
Yeah, it's amazing that contender does good here.
Well, because it was developed in a state.
Yeah. So Georgia doesn't like contender, but for apple, your good cultivars are Fuji, Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, and my favorite, Gala. Though it is more susceptible to things like fire blight. And I did send one of the resources you will be getting is a apple cultivar susceptibility chart by Purdue, I believe. And Gala is one of those ones that, even though I love it so much, it gets sick the most. Very sad. And on the flip side, Red Delicious is actually pretty tolerant of a lot of diseases, even though I think it tastes worse. So for apple, that thing you've heard about having multiple varieties, multiple cultivars is true. You need that for your cross-pollination. Now, I think there are a few exceptions where you don't have to. I don't remember their names, but there are a few. And down here, I don't think any of you guys are really going to do trellising. That's a whole different discussion, but you would need a dwarfing apple rootstock for staking or trellising. Now, this is something that's more done commercially. Current research now is looking at, rather than having your traditional orchard having fruit walls. So this is when you have a tree and your fruiting wood is so small, you're getting 1 fruit per tree. So you can pack these trees in really close, but that requires trellising. And the other reason they're looking at that is because then you can send robots through. Michigan State is doing a lot of research with like robots. You drive on and they have like a little suction cup, and they can, since you have like tiny little fruiting wood with 1 fruit, those robots can come in and pick that fruit off. Because labor in agriculture has always been difficult. So trying to figure out ways to automate that process are being looked at. That's kind of where we're at currently in terms of tech. It's not commercially available yet though. Peach, as you said, Contender, Summer Pearl, which is a white flesh, if I'm not mistaken, Crest Haven, and Encore. So these little abbreviations on the side are for what time during the growing season can you harvest them, because that's the other reason you select a cultivar. When we talk about strawberries later, like way later, you have really 2 types, everbearing and June bearing. June bearing, it's in the name. Everbearing, you can get all the way through, well, probably not now, but you can get all the way through the season. So peaches here, your contender is a mid-season harvest. Summer Pearl is mid-late, and Cresthaven and Encore is late, so we're talking about later in the summer. For example, in Georgia, two cultivars that do well are July Prince and August Prince. You can tell when they're harvested. Typically, our research farm had a lot of July Prince, so we were usually harvesting about the week of the 4th of July, about a week before or after around that time. And then for blackberry, we have Apache, Cheyenne, Navajo, and Shawnee, and these are all erector varieties, meaning that you don't need trellising or anything like that to have them. They're fine. So these were given to me by Karen, so I cannot speak on them too highly, but she did give us pictures, which I am very grateful for. For European pear, we have Moonglow, Honey Sweet, which is that self-fertile exception that I was talking about. Harrow Delight and Fan Still, also self-fertile, and I believe I did these in order. So this should be Moonglow, this should be Honey Sweet, and this should be Harrow Delight. For Asian pear, we have Korean or Hardy Giant, which is this guy. Shinseki, which is also called New Century. No, that's not him. This is Megetsu, and there's also Tenosui.
It's a half European pear, half Asian pear. That's exceptionally well.
Yeah. In the fruit world, we don't care about, well, we care about native and non-native, but at the end of the day, if you're growing an edible crop, you're going to grow it because it produces a good amount of fruit. And for fig, we have Celeste Italian honey, which is green and can trick birds, so they don't think the fruit's ready, so they will not eat them. Olympian and, oh, it's French, Marseille. The Spanish in my brain is not reading that right. Marseille, but they are green. And when we talk about small fruit, however many weeks from now, one of the things that you will have to worry about is fighting nature for your fruit. And this happens too in fruit trees. But really you'll be fighting more with your pests. So planting. This is Mike Parker. He works in Johnston County. They have a very, very large, I forget how many acres, like 500, give or take. It's a ag experiment station with NC State. He is one of their leads. He's a fruit tree specialist, and he had video on peach planting. So rather than explain it to you, I'm going to show it to you.
Hello, I'm Mike Parker, the Tree Fruit Extension Specialist with the North Carolina Cooperative Extension Service at North Carolina State University. Today, we're at the Sand Hills Research Station in Jackson Springs, North Carolina, to look at how we would plant, prune, and maintain peach trees. We are going to discuss today properly planting a peach tree. One of the first considerations when planting peach trees is to select a site. Sunlight is one of the key criteria when we select a site, so we want to select an area that is wide open, that receives full sunlight throughout the day, stay quite a ways away from fence rows and tall trees that will shade the trees during the growing season. Then we must dig the hole. We'll dig that approximately twice the size of the root system, both in width and in depth. On a hole dug with a shovel or with an auger, many times we'll have a smooth wall that will act as a barrier to root penetration to the surrounding soils. So what you do is when you're done with the hole, take a shovel and just scar up the wall so it's no longer smooth. That will allow easy root penetration into the surrounding soil. We are planting this tree today in light sandy soils, which can be very easily done with a hand shovel. Our growers that plant many number of trees will use a subsoil shank that they will till a furrow down the tree row. Then they'll go perpendicular to that, and where those subsoil shanks intersect is where they'll dig the hole to plant their trees. For growers planting trees in heavier soils, many times an auger is used in the back of a tractor. An auger approximately 18 inches wide will drill a hole approximately 2.5 foot deep in which the tree will be planted. For growers planting many acres of trees, a tree planter will be used. A tree planter is an instrument that's attached to the back of a tractor, basically a plow that growers sit behind there and drop their trees into that furrow as the tractor moves continuously down the tree row. When purchasing trees, you can buy bare roots trees, which will come to you with the roots exposed. Many times they'll be wrapped in a moist media of sawdust or possibly paper, shredded paper. You can buy large trees or smaller trees. One of the things key criteria you want to look at is where the grafting. All of the fruit trees that we plant are grafted. They have a root system with a variety grafted on top. You must know where that graft union is when planting your tree. The way to identify the graft union is to start at the base of the tree and move up. There may be a juncture where the tree sort of jags a bit, or there may be an area where the bark changes colors. Many times that will be in a diagonal cut, or there may be even a V shape where the graft union has taken place. The tree we're planting today is a bare root tree. However, you can purchase trees in a pot and plant those as well. When planting bare root trees, you need to plant them in the dormant season to allow the root system to settle in before the growth starts in the spring. With trees that come in a pot, those can be planted at any time. However, care must be taken when the plant is pulled out of the pot to cut through the root system to disturb any roots that may be circling the pot that will continue to grow and strangle the tree over time. Once we have our tree, we identify the graft union, dig our hole so that it's much deeper, but the graft union will remain 2 inches above the soil surface once the tree has been planted and settled. Once we place soil in the hole, we will come in and firm the soil. Identifying our graft union is here, so we're still in good shape. So we may hold the tree here while we'll press the soil around it. Then our graft union is 2 to 3 inches above the soil, which will allow for some settling to occur once the tree is watered in. Once we have planted the tree, we will then water the tree thoroughly around the base. Once the soil is settled, we'll apply a light application of fertilizer around the base. We will go around the edge of the hole, spreading the fertilizer in and out, but making sure to keep it off the trunk of the tree where it may burn the tree.
It really depends on what's available to you, because obviously what's commercially available and what's available to a homeowner are not the same. When I went and had to hand fertilize 300 peach trees in the middle of July, they take about half a cup, by the way. That's about the amount you put. It really depends on the form, because what's used commercially tend to be granules or something that looks more like perlite. And that is what he's talking about with that nitrogen burning. So this is when they get really annoying. You had to crawl under your tree, especially when it's fully grown, and you kind of had to go like this and spread it out. And you kind of want it spread out about a couple feet, diameter from the center of your tree. And of course you want it evenly spread, because you just don't want a little area of nitrogen and the rest of it's not good. So that's that. Of course, these planting instructions are the same regardless of what tree you have, and even for non-fruiting trees. Like, I am sad that my dad didn't learn about this when we planted dogwoods, because we very much did not follow his instructions. I'm surprised they're all still alive. But that's kind of how you plant really a tree in general. Again, 6 inches above. Whether you plant a tree that small or not, it really depends on you. I know in orchards in Georgia, where they tend to do both peach and pecan within the same property, they tend to be bigger than that. Also, pecans grow very, very tall. If someone asks that they want to grow a pecan, tell them no, it's very tall. If you look at some in Georgia, like, we're talking like over 100 feet tall, gorgeous trees, absolutely gorgeous, like giant. And these are trees I've been growing for a very long time, absolutely gorgeous, but not really made for homeowner property. So I had someone ask me about wanting to grow a pecan in their house, and I had to explain how big it gets. So that's kind of the long and the short of it. Again, depending on your size, you might just be working with container fruit, so this may not necessarily apply. Of course, you're going to want to replant to give it more space, but there are container varieties which Karen will talk about. So there's 1,000,002 things that can get in your fruit tree, and Karen will talk about the different levels of maintenance, because figs are wonderful and amazing and also don't really get sick. We know what they get sick with, but they barely get sick, so they're amazing. But everybody else is kind of a little bit of a, you need to take care of it. And if anyone tells you, as much as it warms my heart that someone wants to grow a fruit tree, make sure that people know going in that all these things can happen. And this isn't even the full list. So back to Louise's talk, brown marmorated stink bugs are a pest of apple and pear, along with apple maggots, codling moth, mites, beetles, and woolly appling aphid. Now, these are not all going to be there at the same time. As we learn, insects have different life cycles, they come out at different times. So this is not all going to be happening. If it is, we have a really big problem on our hands. And just some of the diseases you can have. And we have bloomed through fruit set, so this is that first bloom, your petal fall, or when you have your green fruit, that is what those stages are. We can have in apples and pears, apple scab, which is a fungus, leads to malformed fruit. Fire blight, which again is what our galas can get a lot. It is a bacteria and it can cause shoot and branch dieback. And if I'm not mistaken, that's the one that gets the weird goop on the outside. Or is it
Fire blight?
Is it fire blight or apple scab?
No, scab does a little bit.
Yeah, scab gets a weird
You're
like,
thinking of canker.
I think that's what I'm thinking of. There's an apple disease where it gets like a weird translucent something drip on the outside. I forget which one it is, but yeah, but for apple, I forget whether it's fire blight or apple scab. One of the manuals I shared with you guys actually does tell you, but it's easy to tell because if it has that drip, it's a characteristic of just that disease. So all other things, if it has that one trait, you can be like, oh, it's this or this. Can't remember which one though. Also powdery mildew because it affects everything under the sun. Fungus, and it just hinders development. Now fruit set through harvest are baby fruit through our commercially viable fruit. We have black rot, which is a fungus, of course it ruins our fruit. And our fly speck or sooty blotch, which is a fungus and it just makes fruit ugly. It's still edible, it's fine. There are quite a few, if you've ever looked at a peach and you see those little like green spots on it, it's fine. I mean, there's kind of, and I could talk to you guys about the grocery store commercial industry, but there is such a heavy emphasis placed on aesthetics, but sometimes, like in the case of sooty blotch, it's just cosmetic, it's safe, and if you really felt weird about it, you can just cook it down. And of course, that cat nosing that Luis was talking about, this can actually happen with freezes also. When you have a late enough freeze, what happens and how a freeze actually kills a fruit is that all cells have water in them. So when you have a freeze, that water inside your bud freezes and of course ice, it expands, right? So it literally explodes your bud, and that's why you have floral buds or vegetative buds that can die during a freeze. But when you have fruit, it can also cause that cat nosing because a specific clump of cells could die. So it can be temperature or insect related. You need to make sure you ask your questions to figure out which is which. So peach, the biggest culprit on here is the peach tree borer. If you ever see a little hole in your peach, I'm so sorry. You have a tiny little, I'm calling maggots out of personal hatred, but you're gonna have your little tiny maggots from your peach tree borer. They're not very big, they're a beetle. Yeah, so they can get inside. Now, the nice thing about it, if you're not as picky, not picky like me, is that they tend to be so small. You can just cut the little part out, especially if you're cooking them. What I would do when I would get, we obviously got to take home fruit after we harvested like 2 F-250s full, F-250 beds full of fruit. So what I would do is, especially if you don't have a heavily infected fruit and it has your little borer holes, you can just cut them and cut those holes out. Like it's not something that fully infects the fruit. It's like when you have browning on an apple, just cut it off. So those are your biggest culprits. We also have scales. This picture looks worse on this TV. This was a better picture on my computer, but that is our burrower there. We also have oriental fruit moth, Japanese beetles, and stink bugs. And our diseases, our main disease is brown rot. It is called monolinia. It is a fungus. It looks like that. It is so gross when you try to harvest a peach and you think it's firm and your hand rolls around it. It is nasty. It is disgusting. I hate it so much. But the other thing to note about this, and this can happen with other diseases as well with your fruit, is that it can mummify. It can turn into a little shriveled crisp. Now, this is important because these can fall to the ground. And guess what? There are still spores on those mummies. So guess what happens when they fall to the ground? They go and infect your fruit. So it is very important, regardless of what you're growing, that you're picking all your fallen fruit, especially your mummies, from underneath your tree because you just don't want to give them all a head start next year. We can also get peach scab, which again is just one of those makes it ugly diseases, and leaf curl, also a fungus. It infects young twigs and shoots. I'm sorry, that's a typo. And it leads to impaired development and eventual death of fruiting wood. Fruiting wood being your shoots where you have. So that's just an overview of those guys. Figs, again, We love figs. They barely get sick, but when they do, we can have blights, stem cankers, or leaf spots. We can have anthracnose, premature fruit drop, or souring of fruit. Now, they can also, another common culprit is cold injury because they tend to be a little more sensitive to that. And like I was talking about birds. Birds, squirrels, you name it, they might be the reason you don't have any figs, not that it got sick. And again, with our sandy soils in general, we get nematodes, but something specifically to look out for figs is root knot nematode. Then you should be fine, especially if you're growing a fig in a container, a dwarfing fig in a container, you should be okay. But this is if it happens, 5% of the time, if it happens to get sick, these are the culprits for that. So blackberry. So if you ever hear the term caneberry means blackberry, raspberry, okay? And it's because unlike a tree, you have fruiting canes. Think of it almost like, you know how we have a willow tree, that type of architecture? That is what fruiting canes look like on one of those. So those little like whips, those are the canes. That's why they're called caneberry. Blackberry is the one thing we can actually grow around here, so that's why we're covering it. Our pests are stink bugs and spotted winged Drosophila are fruit flies. So for our diseases, we have, and I pulled these pictures from the University of Florida, and you guys will be getting that publication as well. I made sure you guys got all the resources while I was doing this. We have orange felt, which is a parasitic algae. I don't know if it can get up here, but it is a disease that has been recorded in Florida. It's that little orange spotting that you see on those canes. And actually, as it develops more, it just looks like you have like what do you call it? Like that faux leather, that suede material. It just looks like orange suede on your canes when it's fully developed. We can have cane blight and leaf spots and anthracnose, which are all fungus, and spots, dieback, kind of the same typical symptoms you might see, and those are some of our culprits. And with a lot of small fruit, a lot of problems can be caused by harvesting and storing them. These are your abiotic conditions. These are red cell, white droop, and sun scald. Sun scald is sunburn for plants. It is commonly recommended to grow your caneberry or any of your soft body fruit. So raspberries, strawberries fall into this as well. Give them a little bit of shade because this can happen. White droop is kind of, it sometimes happens with sun scald, but it is that loss of humidity and that loss of water in specific little like individual, I don't know what you call them, berries, I guess. Individual little berries, but it tends to, since it requires heat to happen, white droop and sun scald tend to happen at the same time. And red cell is caused by the opposite effect. When you harvest your berries and you put them in the fridge, if you go straight to the fridge, especially if you're harvesting in the middle of July, that temperature drop, that extreme temperature drop in a short amount of time can cause your fruit to turn red again. Now it's fine, you can still eat it, it's totally fine, but of course you look at something that looks a little bit off and you're like, oh my God, what happened? It's fine. If you don't want that, and this is just a small fruit thing, when you harvest it at a cool time in the morning and slowly bring it down to your fridge temperature. And do not wash these if you don't plan on eating them right away. Small fruit are very, very delicate. And this includes grapes, by the way. That you might actually just, the bigger concern is that you're actually gonna tear the fruit or damage the fruit as you're washing it, because like, you know, we're not perfect, we don't all have clouds for hands, we can't keep this fruit fully intact. So while washing it is for disease prevalence, the other reason too is that as you're handling it, if you're not careful, you can cause, like, especially with all these little guys, you can definitely pop one and get a fungus in there. So whether you do vinegar wash or not, I would still wait till you're about to eat them regardless. It is actually good for getting like fruit flies and things though too. A lot of, especially, I never looked at broccoli the same again. When I looked at the flower and I saw all the little insects inside, I'm like, oh my God, okay. I believe in vinegar now.